When white opens the game with the king pawn, if black is looking for a solid, challenging defense, a good reply is c6, turning the game into the Caro-Kann, an opening which has been employed by several world champions and their grandmaster colleagues. This move prepares to confront white's central pawn with d5. Opening the game with c6 does not significantly help black's development, so white may focus on rapid development and try to build an initiative against black's solid setup. Since black is not directly challenging white's center for the moment, a sensible response is to grab more space in the center with d4. When black is ready to fight against white's center with d5, grabbing space in the center while challenging white's e4 pawn. White has a variety of choices, but we'll begin our exploration of the Caro-Kann with one of white's most challenging, as well as natural responses, e5. White grabs space, clamping down on the f6 and d6 squares, restricting black's kingside knight and bishop from using these natural squares for development. An ambitious option to explore is c5, spending a second tempo on the c-pawn in order to attack the d4 pawn. Unlike the French defense, a similar opening in which black plays e6 on the first move to prepare d5. In the Caro-Kann, black's light-squared bishop is not blocked by a pawn, so black's most popular choice is to play bishop f5, activating the light-squared bishop before preparing to close the center with e6. We're going to introduce some interesting ideas explored by grandmasters, but when you're starting out with the Caro-Kann, you may see a move such as bishop d3. This is not a particularly ambitious choice, but it is seen at amateur level from time to time. Since the Caro-Kann often builds a light-squared pawn structure in the center, somewhat restricting the prospects of black's light-squared bishop, black shouldn't mind exchanging the bishops with bishop takes d3, queen takes d3. If black wants to simplify the game, then queen a5 check, intending to offer an exchange of queens with queen a6 is a reasonable path to explore. But another solid choice is to simply play e6. Black's idea is to strike against white's center with moves such as c5 and knight c6, when black shouldn't face any serious problems out of the opening. Offering an exchange of light-squared bishops is not a challenging option at this moment, so a more popular way to develop is knight f3. Focusing on kingside development while supporting the center. Now that the light-squared bishop has entered the action, black can solidify the center with e6. The e6 pawn supports d5, while revealing the dark-squared bishop, preparing the pawn break c5. A popular choice for white is to continue with bishop e2. This modest-looking move is known as the Short variation, named after Grandmaster Nigel Short. Although this may not look like a particularly ambitious choice, black should not underestimate this variation, as several creative attacking grandmasters have played this system as white. One option to consider is knight d7, preparing the thematic pawn break c5. But black may also decide to immediately play c5, striking in the center, adding pressure against d4, and preparing to activate the knight with knight c6. Move order can be quite important in the Caro-Kann. Grandmaster Arkady Knightish, playing white, decided to castle. Of course, there is nothing wrong with this move, but his opponent, former world champion Vishwanathan Anand, was able to continue comfortably with knight c6, adding another attacker against the d4 pawn. If white decides to support the center with c3, one solid plan is knight g to e7, preparing to play bishop g4, pinning the knight on f3, followed by knight f5, when white's center is under intense pressure. In the game, Grandmaster Knightish played bishop e3, developing a piece while supporting the center, when Grandmaster Anand released the tension with the exchanges c takes d4, knight takes d4. White sets up a small trap, as black should not ignore white's serious lead in development and try to grab a pawn with knight takes e5, as this allows white to exploit black's exposed king and undeveloped kingside with bishop b5 check, encouraging black to move the knight once again with knight d7, which is well met by knight takes f5. Black is unable to capture the knight without giving up the d5 pawn, opening up the game, helping white's superior development overwhelm black's passive as well as underdeveloped position. Instead of the greedy knight takes e5, Grandmaster Anand exchanged a pair of minor pieces with knight takes d4, bishop takes d4. Black needs to activate the kingside, and the e5 pawn still has a cramping effect by denying black's knight access to the f6 square. This was no problem for Anand as he played knight e7. Black's plan is simple. He's going to play knight c6, adding pressure against d4 and e5, followed by bishop e7 and castling kingside. Grandmaster Knightish tried to open the position before black was able to comfortably complete his plan with c4. But black simply resolved the central tension with d takes c4, bishop takes c4, and then continued the plan by playing knight c6, threatening white's bishop while adding pressure against the e5 pawn. So white pinned the knight with bishop b5. Black prepared kingside castling while developing the bishop to e7. In the game, white decided to play knight c3, allowing black to castle with a comfortable position. Not only did Grandmaster Anand solve his opening problems, he went on to win the game. If white tried to discourage black from castling with queen a4, adding a second attacker against the pinned knight, black can simply ignore white's idea and castle anyway. The point is that if white plays bishop takes c6, b takes c6, the c6 pawn cannot be captured as this would drop the bishop. And after rook d1, lining up with black's queen, a simple solution is queen c7, connecting the rooks, supporting c6, as well as adding pressure against the e5 pawn. Black enjoys the bishop pair with a comfortable game. Rather than castling, white may decide to immediately support the center with bishop e3, protecting the d4 pawn while adding additional pressure against the c5 pawn. This is a position debated at grandmaster level, especially with black's most ambitious response, queen b6, increasing the tension in the center while adding pressure against the newly unprotected b2 pawn. We can see the dynamic potential of the short variation come to life with knight c3. White focuses on rapid development while inviting black to capture the b2 pawn. Accepting the pawn is a risky decision as queen takes b2 is well met by the surprising queen b1. If black captures white's knight with check, white is prepared to play bishop d2, attacking the queen, followed by queen takes b7, attacking the unprotected rook on a8. If black decides to trade queens with queen takes b1 check, rook takes b1, white enjoys a significant lead in development while the b7 and c5 pawns are both under serious pressure. Grandmaster Pavel Elyanov, playing black, tried to resolve some of the tension with c4, closing the center but allowing his opponent, former World Championship challenger Sergei Caro-Kann, to regain the pawn with rook takes b7, when white was able to turn this active position into a fine victory. Since queen takes b2 allows white the type of active chances the short variation tries to produce, a more reliable option for black is to play knight c6, continuing to intensify the central struggle. One popular option to explore is kingside castling, but it's also important to understand what happens if white decides to relieve the central tension with d takes c5, bishop takes c5. It looks like white is simply helping black catch up in development, but this is not a charitable act. White has a specific idea in mind after trading bishops with bishop takes c5, queen takes c5. Thanks to exchanging the dark-squared bishops, in one grandmaster encounter, Hikaru Nakamura played knight b5, threatening both knight c7 and knight d6 check. So his opponent, Grandmaster Shakhriyar Mamedyarov, played the prophylactic king f8. Black's king is immune from any annoying knight checks, and knight d6 would not be a wise decision, as the e5 pawn would come under serious pressure, and with it, the knight on d6 would become quite unstable. White will favor centralizing the knight with knight b to d4, followed by kingside castling. White enjoys a central space advantage, although this is still double-edged as it will serve as a target for black. Meanwhile, black will likely continue with knight g to e7, and one idea is to expand on the kingside light squares with h5 and g6, taking space and preparing to move the king to g7. Since the center remains closed, black's king should not face any immediate problems. Slightly strange looking, but ultimately solid positions can be the price of admission for prospective defenders of the Caro-Kann. As is typical in the Caro-Kann, there is plenty of play available for both sides, and in this particular game, Grandmaster Nakamura managed to bring home the full point for white.